My name is Rowan Holt. Last month, I came home from a job interview to find the locks changed on my mother's house. My key didn't work. And a text from my sister said it all. Don't come back, your stuff's boxed. I stood on the porch in heels and a blazer, holding takeout in one hand and nothing else to my name. No money. No room. No family. But what they didn't know was this: my grandmother had built a legal trust behind their backs. And when they locked me out, they triggered something bigger than they ever imagined. What happened next? I sued them. And I didn't stop until I got everything back. Before I share how the lawsuit changed everything, drop a comment with where you're watching from and follow the channel for more true stories like this one. You won't believe how it ends. The key didn't turn. I jiggled it once, twice, then pressed my weight into the door thinking maybe the frame had swelled from the heat. It was late afternoon, the kind of humid July day that made every surface stick. I wiped my palms on my jeans and tried again, slower this time, careful. Nothing. My pulse ticked up. I stared at the brass doorknob of my mother's house in Des Moines, Iowa, the house I'd grown up in, the one I'd left and returned to more times than I cared to count. It looked the same as it always had, with the geraniums lining the front steps and the wind chime dancing in the breeze. But something was wrong. I felt it deep in my gut before I even reached for my phone. One new message from Brielle. Just 5 words. Don't come back. Your stuff's boxed. I read it 3 times before the meaning landed. My sister had locked me out. Not metaphorically, literally. She had changed the locks. I knocked, then pounded. I called her name through the door. Nothing. I called my mother, my father. Voicemail. I walked around to the side door by the garage. Locked. The back door. Locked. Every entrance I knew, every shortcut I remembered from childhood was sealed shut. I stood there in the driveway, squinting into the late sun, my hand still clutching the useless key, my other gripping the canvas duffel I'd dragged with me since the interview. I hadn't even changed out of my blazer. My hair was limp, my makeup fading, my heels sinking slightly into the softened concrete. It was the most humiliating I'd felt in years, and that included the day I got laid off 6 months ago. This was supposed to be temporary. A few months back home, after the fashion startup I worked for in Minneapolis collapsed during post-COVID funding cuts. I'd applied to jobs nonstop, freelanced when I could, even picked up shifts at a craft supply store. But savings didn't last forever, and rent in the city was merciless. When I called Brielle and asked if I could stay in the guest room for a few months, she didn't say yes. She said she'd think about it. But then Mom called the next day and said fine. Just 6 months. Just until you're back on your feet. That was 4 weeks ago. From day one it felt like a favor they resented. Brielle imposed rules like I was 15 again. No guests, no noise after 10. Rent due on the 1st or out. Mom dropped hints about openings at the family firm. Dad said little as usual. I kept my head down. I cooked dinners, I cleaned. I sent out resumes, and I stayed out of their way. The interview today had felt like hope. A small fashion brand near downtown was hiring for a junior design assistant. The pay was low, the hours long, but it was something. I left feeling like maybe, just maybe, things could turn. I'd even picked up dinner on the way back. Chinese takeout, Brielle's favorite. Trying to bridge the gap. Now I was standing on the porch with sesame chicken in one hand and no home to walk into. I sat down on the top step, my knees trembling slightly. The wind chime above my head spun in circles, clinking in that cheerful, mocking way. My phone buzzed again, but it wasn't a call. Just an alert, battery low. I called Eli. He picked up on the second ring. Hey cuz. Everything okay? I tried to answer, but my voice cracked. I swallowed and tried again. She changed the locks, Eli. I can't get in. She won't answer. Neither will Mom or Dad. Silence on the other end. Then a quiet sigh. Rowan, check your messages. I did. That text from Brielle. Short, sharp, final. I don't know what to do. All my stuff is in there. My laptop, my portfolio, my sketches, my ID. Even my charger. There was another pause. Then he said, I'm an hour out, but if you need a place. I can't ask you for that. You've got your hands full. I just needed to hear a voice that wasn't trying to erase me. You're not erased, not by me. I hung up before I started crying. Again. The motel near the bus depot was the only place I could afford without booking online. The man at the counter gave me a key without looking up. The room smelled like mildew and old carpet glue. The bedspread was thin and scratchy, the kind of fabric that clings to your skin no matter which way you lie. I dropped my bag by the foot of the bed and sat down slowly. My blazer still clung to me like armor I didn't deserve to wear. I pulled it off, then kicked off my heels one by one until my feet touched the cold, stained floor. My phone was nearly dead, but I didn't plug it in. I just stared at the screen until it went dark in my hand. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. That would come later. Right now, all I felt was the hollow space where family should have been. The hum of the air conditioner in the motel room was the only sound for what felt like hours. I lay on the bed fully dressed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, watching a brown water stain spread like a ghost. My body was still, but my mind wouldn't stop moving. It never did when I was cornered. It always ran backward. Brielle had always been the star. Even when we were kids, she had this way of taking up space that made everyone else shrink without her having to try. Teachers adored her. She got straight A's captained the debate team and somehow managed to look like she walked out of a catalog at 13. I was the little sister trailing behind, quiet, awkward, always sketching in the margins of my notebooks. At home, it wasn't much different. Mom called her efficient, a born leader. Dad just smiled and nodded along. Me, I was sensitive. Dreamy. The kind of kid they said would grow out of it. Except I didn't. I remember the first time I felt truly proud of something I made. I was 15 and had entered a statewide youth fashion competition. I spent weeks designing the dress, cutting fabric I bought with babysitting money, and sewing every seam by hand. The night before the regional showcase, I stayed up till 3 in the morning adding beadwork I learned from a library book. When the judge called my name as the winner, I couldn't breathe. I held the certificate like it was proof that I mattered, that I had something worth showing. I rushed home still in my heels and makeup practically bouncing. I walked into the kitchen and saw Mom standing at the island, sipping her evening tea. Brielle sat on a bar stool scrolling through her phone. I won, I said, breathless. First place. I'm going to the state finals in Chicago next weekend. They want me to bring 2 looks. Mom didn't even flinch. Chicago next weekend. She said it like I'd just announced I was going to the moon. That's the client dinner for the Holloway merger. Your father and I need you there. It's at the Marriott. You're helping with the welcome table. I stood there, my trophy still in the tote bag slung over my shoulder. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. Mom, this is a big deal. I've never been out of state for something like this. They said my work was original. That I had a point of view. She set her tea down a little too hard. Rowan, we are Holt Realty. That name means something in this city. We don't skip major client events to play dress up. Brielle didn't even look up. I nodded slowly. I walked to my room, closed the door, and buried the certificate in the bottom drawer of my desk. I never mailed in the acceptance form. Never mentioned it again. That was the first time I folded. Not the last. But there was one person who didn't let me give up. Grandma Clara. She was Mom's mother, but couldn't have been more different. While Judith wore heels in her own kitchen and had her hair professionally blown out every Thursday, Clara had rough hands from decades of sewing and still used a flip phone with paint flecks on the case. She was the only person who ever asked to see my sketches. The only one who cared how I felt. She used to say creativity is a muscle and if you stop using it, it forgets you. That terrified me more than anything. Forgetting how to create felt worse than failing. Clara taught me to sew straight lines on her old Singer machine in the laundry room with the scent of lavender and starch all around us. She gave me scraps of velvet and linen buttons from old jackets and zippers she saved in a mason jar. Sometimes we'd sit in silence side by side while she worked on a quilt, and I stitched little pockets or hems. It was the only place I felt safe. One afternoon after I'd skipped the finals in Chicago and was walking around the house like a ghost, she pulled me aside on the porch. You did something beautiful, she said, tucking a curl behind my ear. And your mother didn't see it. But I did. Promise me you won't let this house convince you your dreams are foolish. I promised. I meant it too. But promises at 15 are lighter than air. And I had no idea how heavy life would get. Clara passed away my senior year of high school. Cancer quick and brutal. The house changed the day she died. Colder. Quieter. Mom cried exactly once at the funeral, then got back to running the company. Brielle took Clara's old jewelry box without asking. I kept the singer machine though Mom tried to have it thrown out. What are you going to do with that old thing, Rowan? This isn't a thrift store. It sits in my storage unit now. I couldn't bear to sell it. When I got into the University of Iowa, I applied secretly to the School of Art and Design in Chicago. I even got a scholarship. But I never told anyone. I already knew what they'd say, so I enrolled in business like they wanted. Majored in marketing. Took electives in textiles and illustration when I could squeeze them in. Brielle thrived at Holt Realty. She interned in high school, shadowed Mom at every event, had her first solo listing before she was 21. Her face was on bus stop benches before I even had a resume. Meanwhile, I worked nights at a vintage store, saved enough to buy fabric off Etsy, posted my sketches online when I had the nerve. My senior project in college wasn't a business pitch. It was a 10-piece capsule collection I made in my off-campus apartment with thrifted sheets and makeshift mannequins made from duct tape and pillows. I didn't invite my family to the showcase. They wouldn't have come anyway. Now, lying in that motel bed with a dead phone and a knot in my chest, I felt 15 again. Small, unwanted, dismissed. But I also felt something else. Something sharp and steady, like the first prick of a needle through clean cloth. I had given up too many times in the past. I had buried too many dreams in the drawers of that house, but not this time. Not again. Not when I had nothing left to lose. The morning light slipped through the gap in the motel curtains like it didn't care who it woke. I opened my eyes slowly, my body aching from the stiff mattress, the hum of the old air conditioner still droning in the background. My blazer was bunched up under my head like a makeshift pillow, and I was still in yesterday's clothes. I reached for my phone instinctively, only to remember it had died sometime during the night. I sat up, muscles protesting, and padded barefoot across the thin carpet to plug in my charger. Then I froze. My charger was still in my room. Back at the house. Or wherever they'd stashed my things. I stared at the blank screen of my useless phone for a long moment, then dropped it on the bed and let out a shaky breath. I needed to figure things out. Fast. The motel lobby had a small coffee machine and a dusty old computer shoved into the corner for guest use. I slipped on my sneakers and went downstairs. The coffee tasted like cardboard and regret, but it was hot. I sat down in front of the computer and logged into my bank account, hoping I had enough left to cover another 2 nights. My heart dropped. $1,200. Gone. The joint account I had with Brielle, the one we used years ago for splitting car insurance when we briefly shared a vehicle in college, still had my name on it. I had left a cushion there for emergencies. This counted as one. But the balance was 0. Withdrawn 2 days ago. I checked the transaction history. The withdrawal had been made at a branch near Mom's office. The name listed as primary account holder was still Brielle. My name as secondary gave me no rights. No alerts, no access. It wasn't just the house anymore. She had taken my money too. I leaned back in the cracked plastic chair, hands trembling, heart pounding in my ears. I tried not to cry in front of the bored-looking clerk behind the counter who was flipping through a dog-eared tabloid magazine. My hands felt ice cold. I needed help. I logged into the motel's Wi-Fi on the computer and sent a quick email to the design firm where I'd interviewed. Nothing long, just a follow-up and a thank you. I didn't mention that I was technically homeless now. I checked the weather. Thunderstorms in the forecast. Figures. I wrote Eli next. Eli Whitman, my cousin on Mom's side, was one of the few relatives who had never treated me like an afterthought. He lived in Lincoln, about 3 hours away, and worked as a structural engineer. He had always been quiet, steady, the kind of person who could listen without trying to fix everything. I hadn't seen him much in recent years, but I still had his number memorized. I used the motel's front desk phone and dialed. He answered on the second ring. Rowan. You okay? No, I said, and my voice cracked on the word. I'm sorry to call you like this. I didn't know who else. Talk to me. They changed the locks. Brielle drained the joint account. I'm in a motel, I don't even have my charger. My stuff is boxed up somewhere apparently. I can't get through to Mom or Dad. He went quiet for a moment. I could hear the sound of him moving, maybe getting up from a desk or walking through a hallway. I always wondered if she'd do something like this, he said finally. Clara did too. I blinked. Grandma Clara. What do you mean? She talked about it with me. Not specifics. But after her diagnosis, before things got bad, she told me once. If they ever freeze Rowan out, certain things will move into place. I thought she meant emotionally. Like be there for you. I sat straighter. Wait. She said those words. Yeah. That was the last Thanksgiving she was really lucid. She made me promise to watch for it. I didn't know what she meant. I thought she was being dramatic. She wasn't. Apparently not. You said things would move into place. What kind of things I'm not sure. But if I were you, I'd check her attorney's office. Remember old Mr. Walsh? She used to talk about him like he was her secret weapon. I hadn't thought about Edward Walsh in years. He had been Clara's friend since forever, handled all her estate stuff, even the paperwork when she downsized after Grandpa passed. I hadn't seen him since her funeral. I felt a flicker. Just a flicker. But it was something. Thank you, Eli. Really. Do you need a place to stay? I can be there in 3 hours. You don't even have to ask. I wanted to say yes. But I also knew this wasn't the time to fold. Not yet. I think I need to figure something out first. But I might call again. Is that okay? Anytime. And Rowan, yeah. You didn't deserve this. The lump in my throat made it hard to answer. I hung up and returned to my room. The air smelled musty again. I opened the window a crack, letting in the warm breeze. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the cheap nightstand. Then I picked up the motel pen and the back of a receipt and started writing a list. Get charger. Call Edward Walsh. Check about the trust. Find out where they put my stuff. Don't cry. I underlined the last one. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I had $23 in cash, no working phone, no laptop, and no access to anything that used to be mine, but I had a name. A thread of a memory. And maybe, just maybe, one last card to play. I found the listing for Walsh & Price LLP on a public directory site while sitting in the motel lobby with a borrowed charger and a borrowed sense of hope. The email address was generic, but I sent a message anyway, short and direct. My name is Rowan Holt. My grandmother Clara Whitman mentioned Edward Walsh as her estate attorney. I believe there may be something I need to know. I didn't expect an answer so quickly. Less than 2 hours later, a response came through. Not from Edward, but from someone named Megan Price. She said she was a partner at the firm and that she had been managing Clara's trust since his retirement in 2021. She asked if I could come in person. There were documents. Details. She didn't explain further. I borrowed a charger from the front desk again, splashed cold water on my face in the motel bathroom, and pulled my hair back into a bun. My blouse was wrinkled and my jeans were 2 days old, but I figured if this woman was responding to my email at all, she already knew enough not to care about appearances. The office was in a glass front building on Grand Avenue in Des Moines. The kind of place filled with tall plants and soundproof conference rooms. I walked in and gave my name to the receptionist. She gave me a warm smile and told me Megan would be right with me. I sat down on a beige leather chair and tried not to shake. 5 minutes later, a woman in her mid-30s stepped out. She wore a navy suit, no jewelry, her curls pinned back in a loose twist. Her eyes were sharp but kind. Rowan Holt, yes. I'm Megan Price. Thanks for coming on short notice. Let's talk in my office. Her office overlooked the river, neat and minimal with a few framed photos on the windowsill. One looked like a law school graduation, another was a candid shot of her laughing with an older man I assumed was Edward Walsh. She gestured to the seat across from her desk and waited until I sat. "I don't want to waste your time," she began. "I know you're going through something difficult, but what I'm about to show you might shift things." I nodded, my palms flat against my thighs. "Your grandmother Clara created a trust in 2015. It was structured to protect a specific set of assets and ensure a beneficiary's long-term well-being. That beneficiary is you." I stared at her, unsure if I had heard correctly. "Me. Yes. Clara established the trust independently from your parents. She transferred partial ownership of her residence at the time into the trust with a legal condition that it remain a residence available to you whenever you needed it until such a time that you chose not to occupy it." My throat tightened. She put the house in the trust, not the entire property but her legal portion at the time she set it up, which, given her ownership stake, was enough to attach restrictions. Since then, additional funds were deposited into a creative development account under your name managed through the trust. Total contributions over the years add up to roughly $150,000. I sat back, slowly absorbing each word like a blow. "Wait. So that money, that was for me?" "For my career," Megan nodded. "Specifically earmarked for artistic or business development in your chosen creative field." Clara was clear. It was not to be diverted, borrowed, or withheld without your full consent. I felt dizzy. Does Brielle know about this? Based on her recent actions, if she does, she's choosing to ignore it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time I'd been scraping by, thinking no one believed in me. And Clara had quietly built a foundation under me, one I hadn't even known existed. "There's something else," Megan said, folding her hands on the desk. "The trust includes a legal alert protocol. If your access to the residence is denied in a way that suggests exclusion or retaliation, the law firm receives an automated notification tied to the change in property security systems." The locks. Exactly. The trust security clause is tied to digital monitoring on file. When the locks were changed and the alert wasn't cleared through a trustee approval process, it triggered an internal review. That's why I emailed you. That event qualified as a breach. And now that you've confirmed it was intentional, we can proceed. Proceed with what? With enforcement. I swallowed hard. Megan opened a folder and handed me several documents. The first was a copy of the trust deed. Clara's signature stared back at me from the bottom of the page. The next was a breakdown of the financial account. Dates, deposits, notes. Then a memo from Edward Walsh, dated 6 months before his retirement, requesting a review of trustee integrity based on concerns about Judith and Brielle's control. He suspected something. He suspected they would attempt to override your access. Clara did too. That's why she insisted on backup contacts and alerts. My eyes stung. Clara had been gone for years, but it felt like she was sitting right beside me in that office, guiding every step. "There's also this," Megan said quietly. She handed me a sealed envelope. On the back was my name written in Clara's neat slanted handwriting. I took it with both hands, afraid I might drop it. "I'll give you some privacy." She stepped out, leaving me in silence. I opened the letter carefully, the paper thin and slightly yellowed. The scent of lavender clung faintly to the page. I started reading, my eyes tracing every loop of her pen. "My dearest Rowan, if you are reading this, it means the family has failed you in a way I feared they might. I want you to know that you are not weak for needing help. You are not wrong for dreaming bigger than they can understand. This trust is not just money. It is a hand reaching from the past to lift you when they try to bury you. You have a right to your space, your voice, your future. Don't let them convince you otherwise. With all my love, Clara." I read it 3 times before I folded it back into the envelope. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From something fiercer. Like heat in my chest. Clara hadn't abandoned me. She had been planning for this all along. I looked out the window at the slow-moving river. My reflection stared back, faint in the glass. I didn't look strong. I didn't feel strong. But Clara had believed I was. That meant something. I picked up the trust documents, ran my fingers over the embossed seal, and sat back as Megan returned. So she said gently, "What do you want to do next?" I didn't hesitate. "I want to enforce every single word of this trust, and I want to know where my money went." Megan didn't flinch. She nodded once, then turned to her screen and clicked a few tabs open. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard before she printed a short stack of papers. When she handed them to me, her face was calm, but I could see the tension just under the surface. "These are recent disbursements from the creative development account," she said. "All within the last 36 months. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning columns of numbers, vendor names, and dates. Each line told a story I hadn't lived. Holt Interiors. Eden Grove Landscaping. Precision Granite. A $6,000 bill for a custom kitchen island. Another for $23,000 labeled Outdoor Hardscape Redesign. A $12,000 invoice from a luxury furniture boutique downtown. Every dollar spent without my knowledge. Everyone siphoned from funds that Clara meant for me. They used the trust to remodel the house." I looked up. My voice came out low and cold. "They used my money. My future." Megan's jaw tightened. "Yes. And based on these documents, the withdrawals were signed by Judith and Brielle. As trustees, they were legally required to use the funds only in accordance with the trust's terms. These purchases do not align with those terms, not even remotely." It felt like my chest had collapsed in on itself. They didn't just throw me out. They looted everything Clara left for me and then shut the door in my face. I stared at the spreadsheet again, the columns blurring slightly. A total at the bottom made my stomach twist. $123,000. Gone. And the worst part was knowing that I had begged for help just a few weeks ago. Begged to stay. To buy myself time. And all the while, they'd been sitting on stolen comfort. "I don't think I can stay quiet about this," I said slowly. "You don't have to." Megan's voice was measured, careful. "We can begin the process of formally challenging their role as trustees. We can freeze the remaining assets, initiate a civil complaint, and request restitution. But that would be an internal enforcement mechanism. A private legal dispute." She paused. "There's another option." "What is it?" "Litigation. Public. Formal. You'd be the plaintiff in a civil suit. It would mean going to court. Making this visible." I looked out the window. The river shimmered in the sunlight. I thought about the house, about standing outside it like a stranger. About the moment I realized the locks had been changed. About Brielle's message. "Don't come back." They wanted me erased. "If I stay quiet, they'll keep doing this, won't they?" Yes. Most likely. "And if I go to court, they'll fight back. They'll claim family misunderstanding. Maybe even try to paint you as unstable or bitter." "Of course they will. But Clara gave you tools, and now we have documentation. The trust, the spending, the breach. It's enough to build a case." I was silent for a long time. Megan walked over to a side cabinet and opened a drawer. She returned with a slim folder and a small envelope. "This came to the office 2 years ago. Clara left it with instructions to deliver it only if the trust was triggered due to misconduct." She handed it to me. My name was written again on the front, this time in softer ink, shakier handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Rowan, if you are reading this, I'm guessing your heart has been broken in a way I hope to prevent. Let me say what others won't. You do not owe them silence. You do not owe them grace. Do not let anyone use love as a leash. You are not selfish for wanting your life back. You are not wrong for demanding what was promised. Stand tall even if your knees shake." With love, Clara. Tears welled up and spilled before I could stop them. I folded the note and pressed it to my chest. Megan gave me a moment, then sat back down across from me. "I want to file the suit," I said quietly. "I want this public. I want a judge to hear what they did. We'll prepare the complaint immediately. Do I need to testify? Eventually, yes, and we'll want witnesses. Anyone who can corroborate the lockout. The misuse. The family pattern of control. Mrs. Evans." I whispered the name without thinking. "Who?" "Our neighbor. She saw me outside that night. She's known our family for years. She'll tell the truth." Megan nodded. "That helps. I'll reach out." By the time I left the office that day, the sun had dipped low behind the skyline. I held a thick folder in one hand and Clara's note tucked safely into my purse. My footsteps felt steadier than they had in days. Maybe in years. They had taken my home, my money, my name off the front door. But they hadn't taken my voice. And I was finally ready to use it. Megan filed the complaint on a Monday morning. It was crisp, direct, and nearly 100 pages long. I watched her scan the final draft one last time before submitting it through the civil court portal. Her expression was calm, but I knew what this meant. Once it was filed, there was no undoing it. I wasn't just pushing back behind closed doors anymore. I was stepping into the light. The lawsuit included 3 main allegations: breach of fiduciary duty by the trustees, unauthorized use of trust funds for personal enrichment, and unlawful denial of residential access granted under the trust's terms. My name was listed as the sole plaintiff. Judith Holt, Brielle Holt, and Holt Realty were named as defendants. I stared at the digital timestamp as it appeared on the confirmation screen. The lawsuit was real now. Public. By Wednesday, the news had broken. It started with a small legal blog that followed Iowa civil filings. Then it jumped to a community Facebook group in Des Moines. Someone posted a summary with the title "Girl Sues Family After Being Locked Out of Trust Home." A local reporter picked it up by Thursday. I got a text from Eli with a link and 2 words. "It's out." I read the article in a daze. It quoted the trust's language word for word, mentioned the $150,000 set aside for my career, and highlighted the home renovations paid for without consent. There was a photo of the house, a headshot of Brielle pulled from Holt Realty's website, and a cropped image of me from a college alumni event I barely remembered attending. Within days, Holt Realty started to bleed. A major investor from Chicago backed out of a pending commercial deal. Clients began asking questions. Online reviews took a nosedive. Their public relations officer issued a vague statement about private family matters, but it only fueled the fire. People weren't just angry about the financial breach, they were furious about the optics. A family cutting out one of their own, taking everything and pretending it was justified. I tried not to read the comments, but they were everywhere. "This is what generational greed looks like. Hope she takes every penny they stole. Blood doesn't give you the right to erase someone." The more the story spread, the more the temperature rose inside the Holt household. I got a call from an unknown number one night around 8:30. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then a third. On the 4th ring, I picked up. Brielle's voice came through sharp and furious. "You want to ruin your life over this, really, Rowan? You think dragging us through the mud is going to get you what you want?" My hand tightened around the phone. "I'm getting back what was mine. You're making enemies in your own bloodline. You don't come back from that. You already made that decision for me when you locked the door." She let out a sharp breath. "You're not just hurting Mom and Dad. You're hurting the business. Do you even understand what's happening perfectly? You're a fool. You'll burn everything down just to play the victim." I stayed silent. "Say something, Rowan." "You say I'm burning things down," I said quietly, "but I think you're just afraid that the house was never yours to begin with." She was silent for a long beat. "You're cutting your own legs off. Number. I'm taking back the ground I was standing on all along." Then I hung up. I let the silence settle after that call. I didn't cry, I didn't throw the phone. I just sat on the edge of the motel bed and let the quiet prove to me that I was still standing. That same night, Megan emailed me an update. The court had set a preliminary hearing date for 2 weeks out. She also confirmed that Mrs. Evans, our neighbor, had agreed to testify. She remembered seeing me outside the night the locks were changed. She also remembered a conversation she had with Clara 2 years earlier about protecting my rights in that house. Another brick in the foundation. Every day I checked my inbox for updates. Every night I reminded myself that this fight wasn't just about money or property, it was about reclaiming the space I had been told I didn't deserve. About proving that Clara's trust wasn't just legal, it was moral, it was right. I started sleeping better, eating again. I found a part-time shift at a small design co-op near downtown that let me sketch on slow afternoons. It wasn't much, but it gave me back a little structure. A place to put my hands to work while the legal wheels turned. And when I walked past newsstands and saw the words Holt family dispute across a glossy headline, I didn't flinch. They had wanted me silent. But I had chosen the law. I had chosen the truth. And I wasn't backing down. It was late Friday afternoon when Eli called and asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. His voice was steady, but there was a current beneath it I didn't recognize. He offered to drive down from Lincoln and said he had something important to give me. I told him to meet me at the small coffee shop next to the co-op where I'd started working part-time. He arrived early like always. He looked tired, worn down in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. He ordered 2 iced coffees and slid one across the table to me without a word. "You said you had something." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive. The kind that fit on a keychain. He held it between 2 fingers for a moment before setting it gently on the table between us. "I found this going through a box of old stuff from Grandma's place. Back when I helped her pack up in 2015, right after she updated her estate documents, she gave me this and told me not to listen unless things went south. I think it's time." I stared at the drive. "What's on it?" "A recording. I listened to it once before coming here. Rowan, you need to hear this." We walked back to the co-op after closing where I had a key and access to a back office. I plugged the flash drive into the desktop computer, clicked on the single audio file, and turned the volume up. Clara's voice filled the room first. Calm but firm. "I'm not changing the documents, Brielle. I already told you." Then Brielle's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "She's not even part of this family, Grandma. She doesn't work. She doesn't show up. All she does is draw things no one wants to wear." Clara cut in again. "She dreams. She tries. That's more than most." There was a pause. Then Brielle again, colder. "If you don't update the trust, I'll tell Mom everything. You know she won't stand for this." Clara's voice unwavering. "You think threats will make me doubt my own judgment? If I didn't believe in Rowan, I wouldn't leave her a single cent. But I do. And that terrifies you, doesn't it?" I reached forward and stopped the playback. My fingers were trembling. Eli sat across from me, his face pale. She tried to force her hand. Even back then. I nodded, swallowing hard. She hated that Clara saw me. That she trusted me with something real. We sat in silence for a moment before I saved a copy of the audio file onto my own flash drive and tucked it into my bag. It was one more piece of truth. One more piece of Clara still fighting for me from the other side. That night, I was folding laundry in the motel when the knock came. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting a reporter or maybe someone from Holt Realty trying to smooth things over. But it was my father. Gerald Holt stood in the dim hallway with his hands tucked into the pockets of a windbreaker. His hair was more gray than I remembered, and his shoulders seemed smaller than they used to be. He didn't speak right away. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside wordlessly. He sat on the only chair while I perched on the edge of the bed. "You found me," I said finally. "It wasn't hard. I waited." He exhaled. "Your mother and your sister have always had strong opinions. You know that." That's one way to put it. I should have said something. A long time ago. About the way they treated you. About what Clara wanted. You knew I knew pieces, enough to feel uneasy. But every time I started to ask questions, your mom would cut me off. Or Brielle would say I was imagining things. I didn't want to cause waves. I looked at him hard. You stood by while they erased me. I didn't want to lose everything. And I did, I snapped. I lost everything because you wouldn't raise your voice. You let them shut the door in my face. You let them steal from me. His shoulders sagged. I know. Do you? Because silence is a choice too, Dad. And yours made you part of this. He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet. I came tonight not to ask for forgiveness. I came because I see it now. What they've done. What I allowed. I can't undo any of it. But I had to tell you face to face that you were right. That didn't fix anything. But it cracked something open in me. Maybe he hadn't been cruel. Maybe he had just been cowardly. But in the end, I had suffered all the same. He stood to leave. His voice shook as he said it. Whatever happens in court, I'll speak if you need me to. I'll tell the truth. I didn't answer. Not right away. He left without asking for a hug. Without trying to make it neat. I closed the door and sat in silence, the motel room buzzing faintly around me. The past was no longer a distant ache. It was on tape. It was walking into my space and looking me in the eye. And for the first time, I felt like the darkness was beginning to crack open. The courthouse in Polk County stood tall and gray against the early morning sky. I arrived with Megan 20 minutes before the hearing, my stomach coiled into tight knots. I wore the only blazer I hadn't folded into the bottom of my suitcase, my hair pulled into a bun, my hands clenched to keep from trembling. The hearing was being held in a modest civil courtroom on the 3rd floor. No cameras. No jury. Just a judge, 2 long tables, and the growing weight of everything that had brought me here. On the other side of the room, Judith sat in a navy skirt suit, her lips drawn into a tight line. Brielle wore all black, her expression unreadable. Gerald sat a few seats down, not beside them, but not beside me either. Their lawyer, a woman named Carla Hendricks, wore a practiced smile and a stack of notes that looked rehearsed down to the punctuation. Megan leaned toward me. Stay grounded, let the evidence speak first. Truth wins if we keep the noise out. Judge Manning entered promptly at 9. A woman in her early 60s, stern but not unfriendly. She adjusted her glasses and began reading from the case summary. This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of Rowan Holt versus Judith Holt, Brielle Holt, and Holt Realty regarding breach of fiduciary duty, unlawful removal of residential rights, and misuse of trust assets. Hearing those words out loud shifted something inside me. It was no longer just pain. It was structure. A frame. A claim. And I was not invisible in it. Carla Hendricks stood to speak first. Your Honor, the defendants maintain that they acted under the belief that they held rightful discretion over the property and financial accounts in question. At no point was their intent to harm Miss Holt. Rather, they sought to make decisions in the best interest of the home's value and family legacy. Megan's response was crisp. Respectfully, that statement directly contradicts the trust's language, which does not grant discretion over occupancy without the consent of the beneficiary. Furthermore, the financial records show personal enrichment under the guise of renovations that provided no benefit to Miss Holt, who was at the time not residing in the home due to forced exclusion. She handed up a copy of the trust, highlighting the clause that guaranteed my lifetime right to occupy the property and another clause specifying the Creative Development Fund's restricted use. Then she handed over the spending records. 32 pages, kitchen remodel, patio furniture, luxury tile. A surround sound system for a living room I hadn't stepped foot in since April. Judge Manning skimmed through the documents slowly, then looked up. Miss Hendricks, did your clients obtain approval from the beneficiary before initiating these expenditures? Carla cleared her throat. Not formally, Your Honor. They interpreted the renovations as necessary maintenance. Necessary maintenance does not include $12,000 spent on designer lighting, the judge said dryly. Then Megan pressed play on the audio. Clara's voice filled the courtroom. Calm. Firm. Brielle's voice sharper, angrier. The words cut the air. If I didn't believe in Rowan, I wouldn't leave her a single cent. I saw Brielle's shoulders tense. Judith stared straight ahead, her face unreadable. Finally, Megan called Mrs. Evans to the stand. The bailiff swore her in, and the elderly woman made her way up carefully, her cane tapping softly on the linoleum floor. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Judge Manning. Can you tell us what you witnessed on the night in question? I saw Rowan outside the house. She was crying. Knocking. I asked if she was okay, and she said the locks had been changed. Did she try to contact her family? Yes. No one answered. Did you ever speak with Clara Whitman about the trust? I did. Several times. She told me she worried about Brielle taking over everything. She said the trust was her way of protecting Rowan's place in the family. Thank you, Mrs. Evans. And then Megan called my father. I didn't breathe. Gerald rose slowly, walked to the stand, and was sworn in. He avoided looking at me. Mr. Holt, can you describe your role in the management of the trust? I was listed as a co-trustee after Clara passed. But my wife and daughter handled most of the communication with the attorneys and the finances. Were you aware that funds were withdrawn for home improvements? Yes. Did you approve them? Judith said it was necessary to modernize the house. She said it would make things easier to justify if questions came up. Did you ever ask Rowan for her permission number? Why not? Because I was told it wasn't needed. And I didn't want to challenge what had already been decided. His voice cracked on the last word. Thank you, Mr. Holt. I saw the judge make a note. When the hearing recessed for lunch, the room felt like a balloon about to pop. Megan touched my shoulder gently. That was significant. He finally admitted it. Yes. And that changes the tone of everything. I stood and walked into the hallway, my legs heavy. I could feel Brielle's eyes on me as I passed, but I didn't look back. For the first time in years, the story wasn't being told by them. It was being told by facts, by voices that had once been silent. And that changed everything. By the following week, Holt Realty was in free fall. The Des Moines Business Journal published a front-page spread titled, Legacy Cracks, Holt Family Lawsuit Ripples Across Real Estate Market. Another development deal collapsed, this time with a residential project that had been in negotiation for months. 2 more clients pulled out, citing concerns about financial transparency. And on local radio, talk show hosts dissected the case like it was a soap opera. Brielle had built the company's brand on the image of strength, family, and stability. Now that image was cracking in the most public way possible. I didn't rejoice in the chaos, but I couldn't deny the quiet justice of it. For once, their consequences didn't arrive behind closed doors. They arrived on headlines across contracts in the same spaces they had once used to silence me. Megan and I met that Thursday to prepare for the next hearing. She handed me an envelope before we began. This was delivered to the office this morning, she said. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folded sheet of thick stationery written in Brielle's unmistakable cursive. Rowan. Please. Enough. Take the house. Take the fund. I won't fight you anymore. I was wrong. Brielle. That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just surrender in 7 lines. I stared at the paper, feeling nothing. Not anger, not relief. Just a strange, hollow stillness. The kind that comes when you've walked through a storm and realize the wind can't touch you anymore. I remembered the first time she called me a burden. I was 15, standing outside the kitchen while she and Mom talked over wine. She thought I was out back sketching. I wasn't. I had come in to grab a glass of water and froze when I heard her say it. She needs to grow up, Brielle had snapped. She's just floating around in some fantasy. It's embarrassing. She's a drain on this family. Mom had said nothing. That word clung to me for years. Drain. Useless. Embarrassment. I remembered her slamming my sketchbook shut when I showed her my senior portfolio. Nobody's going to buy this. Stop wasting time. And years later, when I came home after the startup failed, she stood in the living room with her arms crossed, looking through me like I was already gone. You're almost 40, Rowan. You still think the world owes you a stage. I had absorbed it all. And still somehow I had hoped for more. Now she wanted to offer me the house and the fund like that erased what she'd done. I took out a pen, flipped the card over, and wrote 2 words. Too late. I sealed the envelope and left it with Megan. She didn't ask what I had written. She just nodded once and added it to the case file. Later that night, I sat in the back booth of the same cafe where I had met Eli. The place was quiet, soft jazz playing over the speakers, the kind of setting that once would have made me feel like I didn't belong. But not now. Now I felt solid in my skin. Steady. Not because the lawsuit was almost over, but because I had learned I could survive without their approval. Without their definitions of value or love or success. I thought about Clara's voice in the recording. Her refusal to be bullied into rewriting the trust. The fierce clarity in her words. If I didn't believe in Rowan, I wouldn't leave her a single cent. She had seen me. Not as a burden, not as a mistake. But as someone worth fighting for. And this time I was the one doing the fighting. Without tears, without apology, and with no interest in turning back. The courthouse was packed by the time I walked in. Reporters didn't have access to the room, but that didn't stop them from hovering in the hallway, whispering, checking their phones for live updates. My case had become a symbol of something bigger: family betrayal, financial abuse, the kind of slow-burn revenge story that people couldn't stop watching. Megan met me outside the courtroom doors. She looked sharp in a charcoal suit and calm in the way only lawyers and poker players could manage. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded once. There wasn't anything left to fear. Not anymore. Inside, the air was stiff with tension. Brielle sat at the defense table, her jaw tight, eyes fixed on the wood grain in front of her. Judith sat beside her, cheeks pale, fingers twisting the strap of her purse over and over like a lifeline. Gerald was a few rows behind them, alone. Megan and I took our seats. The judge entered. Court came to order. This was it. Judge Manning began by summarizing the case: the breach of fiduciary duty, the misuse of the creative fund, the unlawful lockout, and the emotional and financial harm inflicted on me as the sole named beneficiary of the Clara Whitman Trust. I listened carefully, eyes steady, breathing even. I had waited a long time for someone to say these things out loud. The findings of this court are now entered into record. She paused. It is the judgment of this court that the defendants Judith Holt and Brielle Holt knowingly and repeatedly violated the terms of the Clara Whitman Trust, resulting in financial misappropriation, unlawful denial of beneficiary rights, and breach of legal and ethical obligations as trustees. She looked up from her notes straight at them. Effective immediately, all trustee authority is revoked. The defendants are to be replaced by an independent trustee approved by the court. Neither of them moved. Brielle's shoulders were drawn so tight she looked carved from stone. Judith had stopped twisting her purse. She just sat there, her lips parted slightly, blinking like she hadn't processed what she'd heard. Judge Manning continued. Restitution in the amount of $80,000 is to be paid to the trust within 90 days. Failure to do so will result in asset seizure per state code. There was a murmur from someone in the back of the room. Furthermore, the plaintiff, Miss Rowan Holt, is granted full access to all remaining funds as outlined in the original trust document, to be used at her sole discretion in pursuit of her career and residence. I felt my breath catch, not from surprise but from the finality of it. This wasn't temporary, this was mine. Additionally, the court recognizes the wrongful retention of the plaintiff's personal property, which must be returned within 15 business days. Any failure to comply will result in fines and further sanctions. And finally, due to clear and repeated emotional harm, the court issues a limited no-contact order. Neither Judith Holt nor Brielle Holt may initiate direct communication with the plaintiff without her prior written consent. It felt like the air had shifted. Not lighter exactly, just clearer. And now the court requires that both defendants submit formal written apologies to the plaintiff acknowledging their breach and its impact. These apologies will be entered into the public record. Judith let out a small gasp. Brielle still didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the judge, her expression unreadable. But I saw the flush creeping up her neck. The silence was punishment enough. Judge Manning gavelled once. Court adjourned. Megan turned to me, her voice low. You did it. Number Clara did. I just followed the blueprint. She smiled softly, then handed me a small envelope. Inside was the legal transfer authorization for the condo I had chosen the week before. Attached was a single key. Not a symbolic one. A real one. To a real home. My home. I rose from my seat, slowly absorbing the moment. Judith was crying, quietly. The kind of tears that come too late. Brielle stared down at her hands like they were foreign to her, as if they had acted without her permission. Neither looked at me. Gerald stood as I passed him. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed me to the door. I didn't look back. Outside, the sun was hot on the concrete. Reporters surged forward, cameras raised, voices calling my name. I walked past them, all, the key clutched in my palm like an anchor. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. They had locked me out of the house I grew up in. Now I had a set of keys no one could take away. And I hadn't needed their permission to turn the lock. Of all the places I imagined ending up, I never thought it would be a third-floor walk-up in East Village with creaky hardwood floors and windows that caught the morning light just right. The building sat above a little independent bookstore and smelled like ground coffee and old paper. It wasn't big. Just a one-bedroom with an open kitchen and a patch of sunlight that moved across the living room floor like a promise. But it was mine. The first night I slept there, I didn't unpack anything. I lay on the floor in a sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. No voices behind walls telling me to grow up. No footsteps pacing the hallway muttering about responsibilities and reputations. Just quiet. My quiet. A week later, my boxes arrived. Eli drove them in from my old storage unit near Ankeny. It took us an afternoon to carry them up the narrow staircase, both of us sweating and laughing the whole time. "You sure you don't want the elevator life?" he joked, setting down the last box marked fabric. "This is the elevator life," I said. "Just vertical cardio included." That night after Eli left, I opened the box Clara had labeled in her neat cursive years ago. It was the last one I'd unpacked. I hadn't been ready until then. Inside were her sewing tools. A faded pincushion with tiny pearls still stuck in it. A pair of sharp silver shears. A notebook with her initials on the cover and fabric samples pressed between the pages. And at the very bottom, my first sketchbook. The one she gave me for my 16th birthday. I hadn't seen it in years. I ran my hand over the cover and flipped through the pages. There were pencil drawings of things I never had the skill to make back then. Twirled hems. Embroidered collars. Skirts that looked like they could fly. I could hear her voice so clearly. "Never let them cut the thread, sweetheart. Not if it leads to who you are." I spent the next few weeks building something new. I started small. Repaired an old sewing machine Eli found at a garage sale. Set up a folding table by the window. Bought a dress form with some of the remaining funds. And I worked. Hours every day. Drafting, sewing, failing, adjusting, starting again. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I named the collection Clara's Thread. It felt right. A tribute. A tether. A line running from her hands to mine. Megan visited one Saturday afternoon bringing takeout and a bottle of wine. "This place is so you," she said, kicking off her heels as she stepped inside. "Messy alive." She walked over to the dress form and ran a hand over one of the pieces in progress. "You've been busy." "Working through a little therapy with fabric," I said. She smiled. "You didn't just win a case, Rowan. You rebooted your life. Most people never get to do that." I poured 2 glasses of wine. "Most people don't have a Clara in their corner." She looked at me, eyes soft, number. "But they have you now. Someone who made it through the worst parts and came out sewing." We clinked glasses. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. A week later, I launched the website, clarasthread.com. It was simple. Clean. A landing page with 5 pieces, all handmade, photographed on mannequins with soft lighting and no filters. Each design had a short description beneath it, and at the bottom of the page, a quote from Clara's notebook. "Sew the life you imagine." The orders didn't pour in. But they came. A few at first. Then a feature on a local blog. Then a DM from an art director in Minneapolis asking if I would consider showcasing my line at their fall gallery event for women in design. I said yes before I could overthink it. The day the first full payment hit my business account, I stood in the middle of the apartment and cried. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. The condo didn't have much furniture yet. No couch, no rugs, just a secondhand lamp and a beanbag chair I bought on impulse. But every corner held something that was mine. Fabric swatches pinned to corkboard, a calendar with design deadlines. My old sketchbooks lined up like a library of the girl I used to be. The building was quiet most days. A lot of artists, freelancers, a cellist, who practiced at odd hours. I didn't mind. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of creating in solitude. Sometimes I'd sit by the window in the early morning with coffee and watch the sun spread across the floor and think about what Clara might say if she were here. I think she'd smile. Not because I had won, but because I had chosen not to let their smallness shrink me anymore. No one was going to clip my wings again. And this time, if anyone tried, I knew how to stitch them back myself. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-June when my phone buzzed, screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. Brielle Holt. For a moment, I just stared at it. The sun was rising slow over East Village, casting soft amber light through the window onto my sketch table. My coffee sat untouched. Beside it, rough pencil outlines of a fall jacket I'd been reworking all weekend. Next to that, an old photo of Clara, arms crossed and eyes blazing with the kind of pride I hadn't realized lived in me too. The phone kept ringing. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Let it go to voicemail. Pretend I hadn't seen it at all. But curiosity isn't always polite, and closure has a voice of its own. I picked up. Her voice was faint like wind trying to push through a cracked window. Rowan. I didn't say anything. She tried again, softer this time. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. I don't know where else to go. I lost the appeal. The court upheld everything. The money. The trustee change. The no contact order. Holt Realty. It's barely standing. Clients left. Contractors won't return calls. I moved out of the family house last week. Mom's living with a cousin in Cedar Falls. Dad won't answer me. It's all gone. She paused like she was waiting for me to offer sympathy. I didn't. She exhaled slowly. You won. You got what you wanted. Can we stop now? Can you withdraw the lawsuit before they file contempt over the delay in restitution? Please. I'm asking. I'm tired. Her voice cracked at the end like something inside her finally gave way. I waited a beat. Then another. And then I spoke. When I lost my job and asked to stay for 6 months while I looked for something else, you said I was pathetic. You said I was almost 40 and still living in a fantasy. When I begged you not to change the locks while I was at an interview, you packed my life into boxes and told me I wasn't family. I slept in a motel for 5 nights with $23 left in my account. You never called. You never asked if I was okay. I could hear her breathing on the other end, slow and uneven. I'm not withdrawing anything. Not because I want revenge. Not anymore. But because people like Clara wrote rules for a reason. Because when we break them, there should be consequences. And because I don't owe you a clean exit after you buried me alive. She didn't speak. I ended the call. No shouting, no final insult, just silence. I placed the phone face down on the table and looked back at the sketch in front of me. A high-collared coat with hand-stitched embroidery across the shoulders. I picked up the pencil and darkened a few lines. In my mind, I could hear Clara's voice again, sharp and clear. Keep sewing, even when they tell you to stop. A notification pinged on my laptop. An email from the Des Moines Arts Collective confirming my fall showcase slot. My first public exhibition. My name, my designs, my story stitched into every seam. I smiled, letting it sink in. I stood up and walked across the room to the bookshelf, pulled out Clara's notebook again. Tucked inside the front pocket was a photo of us in her old living room. I was 16, awkward and hopeful, holding up a crooked dress I'd made from leftover curtain fabric. She was laughing, one hand resting on my shoulder, the other clutching a pincushion like a trophy. I framed it and set it beside the window where the light touched it every morning. Some people are born into families. Others build one from threads left behind. Eli still called every week to check in. Megan had become more than a lawyer, she was a friend who could finish my sentences. I met artists through the collective who invited me into their world, who didn't need to ask where I came from to understand why I stayed up all night with a needle in my hand. This was my family now. Made not from blood but from belief. And I was finally fully home. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, if you've fought to prove your worth in a room where no one clapped, I want to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. Tell the world how you rose again. And if this story spoke to you, follow the channel. There are more stories coming. of justice, of courage, of finding your voice and refusing to give it back.